Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes.
Great to be here.
Today we're embarking on a comprehensive deep dive into a monumental work, Theory of Games and Economic Behavior by John von Neumann and Oskar Morgenstern.
A real heavyweight.
Absolutely. And we're not just, dipping our toes in. We're aiming to plunge into the entirety of this influential text. We want to really understand his perspective on games and its early ambitious aims for economics and sociology.
Indeed. This book, it's dense, no doubt, but it fundamentally laid down a completely new way of thinking about strategic interactions.
Yeah.
So our mission today really is to trace its core arguments from, well, beginning to end, see how these ideas built on each other, and maybe grasp the full scope of what the authors were envisioning.
Okay, so for someone maybe coming to this fresh, what's the bird's eye view? What are the main things von Neumann and Morgenstern are trying to get across here?
Well, in essence, the book provides a mathematical framework. It's for analyzing situations where multiple individuals make decisions that affect one another. They call these situations games, obviously.
Right, games.
They start by rigorously defining what a game is. A set of rules, sequences of moves, outcomes. A really key move is introducing strategies.
Strategies, okay.
Yeah. These simplify the games by looking at complete plans of action. Now, the initial focus is heavily on zero-sum two-person games.
Where one person wins, the other loses, basically.
Exactly. One player's gain is directly the other's loss. And utility theory, how individuals value different outcomes, that's crucial for understanding rational choices within these games.
Makes sense.
And as the book progresses, it tackles more complex scenarios, games with more than two players, the potential for cooperation, situations with imperfect information. Their overarching ambition really was to apply this whole framework to understand economic behavior more rigorously.
Okay, that gives us a great map, a really good starting point. Now let's really get into the details.
Yep.
Follow their thinking step by step.
Hmm.
Where do von Neumann and Morgenstern actually begin their exploration? How do they set the stage?
They start by confronting the existing landscape, what economic thought looked like then, and the challenges of applying mathematical methods to it.
Okay.
They observed that economics lacked a sort of universally accepted theoretical system. And they felt that just trying to model complex economic stuff with the math they had at the time, well, it hadn't been entirely successful.
So they saw problems with how math was being used.
Yeah, they argued there were issues with superficial applications, just translating theories into symbols without deeper analysis, or maybe failing to account for the crucial interdependence of economic actors. That was a big one.
It sounds like they felt economics needed a more fundamental mathematical toolkit, something new.
Precisely. They pointed out that unlike physics, which had a strong empirical foundation when it was being mathematized, economics, well, its empirical base was weaker at the time. They believed that a true mathematical treatment of economics, particularly when dealing with interactions between individuals, it needed new mathematical techniques. A different way of framing the problems, really.
And this is where the games come in.
Exactly. This is where their focus on games comes in. They argued that understanding the logic of strategic interaction in games, even simple ones, could provide the bedrock for a more robust understanding of economic behavior.
They make quite a big distinction between like a single economic actor, the Robinson Crusoe example comes up, and situations with multiple participants. Why was that distinction so critical for them?
Yes, that distinction is absolutely central. In a Crusoe economy, decision-making is isolated, right?
Right. Just him and the island.
His choices don't directly depend on or influence another individual's choices in a strategic way. But in most real economic situations, a buyer and seller negotiating, multiple firms competing the outcomes for each participant depend on what everyone else does. These are the games they're interested in. They argue that the traditional focus on the isolated actor, while maybe useful in some limited contexts, just doesn't capture the essential dynamics, the interdependence that drives economic activity.
It's like Crusoe playing solitaire versus the real economy being this complex multiplayer game.
That's a great way to put it, exactly.
And the number of players matters too. I recall reading that.
Absolutely. They note that when you have a very, very large number of participants, think of a perfectly competitive market, the influence of any single individual becomes tiny. So you can often use simplifying assumptions there.
Right.
But the really thorny and frankly interesting problems arise when you have a small number of key players, like a duopoly or an oligopoly.
Right, where everyone's watching everyone else.
Exactly. In those situations, each player's strategic choices, their anticipation of what the others will do, That becomes paramount. And this is where game theory really shines, offering tools to analyze these interdependent decisions.
So, okay, they've established the need for this new approach, rooted in the logic of games. Then they move on to discuss utility theory. How does understanding what people want fit into this mathematical framework of strategic interaction?
Well, utility theory is foundational. It has to be. Because it attempts to quantify individual preferences.
To put a number on wanting something.
Sort of, yeah. To build a mathematical theory of rational decision-making in games, you need a way to represent how much a player values different outcomes. Von Neumann and Morgenstern, they dig into how we can understand utility by looking at people's preferences, especially between certain outcomes and probabilistic combinations of other outcomes.
Like the classic, take $50 for sure, or flip a coin for $100.
Precisely that kind of thing. Your choice reveals something about the utility you assign to those different monetary values, and maybe your attitude towards risk.
And they make some pretty fundamental assumptions about these preferences, don't they? Like this idea of completeness.
Yes, they assume individuals have complete and transitive preferences. Completeness basically means that for any two possible outcomes, you can clearly say if you prefer A to B, B to A, or if you're indifferent between them.
You can always compare them.
Right. And transitivity means if you prefer A to B and B to C, then you must prefer A to C. Seems logical, right?
Yeah, sounds feasible.
No, these assumptions are simplifications of how people really behave sometimes, but they're necessary to build a coherent mathematical model of rational choice.
And they needed a specific kind of utility, didn't they? One that lets you calculate mathematical expectations properly.
Exactly, that's a key point. They distinguish between ordinal utility, which just ranks preferences, like I like pizza more than salad,
Right.
and cardinal utility, which provides a numerical measure of the intensity of those preferences, how much more you like pizza.
Ah, okay.
For game theory, especially when you're dealing with risk and uncertainty, they needed a concept of utility that allowed for calculating expected values. What's the average payoff you expect from a risky choice? This led them to develop an axiomatic approach to utility. It supports its numerical representation, unique up to what's called a linear transformation. Basically, it lets us assign numbers to represent utility in a way that allows us to compare and calculate expected outcomes meaningfully.
Okay, so with this groundwork on utility sorted, they then pivot to the general formal description of games of strategy. This feels like where they really lay out the core building blocks of their theory. What are the key pieces here?
Right. This is where they get really precise. They start by defining what constitutes a game in their context. And it's not just, chess or poker.
It's broader.
Much broader. Any situation involving a set of players, rules that govern the sequence of moves, the choices available at each move, the information each player has, and crucially, a clearly defined outcome for every possible sequence of actions.
So the rules, the players, the choices, the info, the results.
Exactly. And they emphasize the distinction between the abstract game, the complete set of rules, and a specific play of the game, like one instance of playing chess. Similarly, a move is defined as an occasion where a player has to make a choice.
And information seems really critical in how players make these choices. How do they formalize that idea, the idea of information within a game?
Very carefully. They introduce the concept of body of information. It's essentially the set of all possibilities that a player considers to be potentially true at a given point in the game.
Okay, what you know or think you know.
Pretty much. As the game unfolds, players receive signals or observe actions. This can refine their body of information, maybe eliminate some possibilities. They use the idea of partitions to represent how information is structured.
Partitions.
Yeah, think of it like this. Your information divides the possible game histories into sets. Within each set, you can't distinguish which specific history occurred, but you know it's one of those. As you get more info, these sets get smaller, more refined. Each move can potentially lead to a finer partition of your information.
Okay. That makes sense. And this all leads up to the really pivotal concept of a strategy. How do they define a strategy in this formal setup?
A strategy is defined as a complete plan of action. It specifies what a player will do in every possible situation they might encounter during the game, given the information available to them at that specific point.
Wow, so it's like a massive contingency plan.
Exactly. It's a rule that tells the player which choice to make at every single decision node they could possibly reach. What's so powerful about this concept, this idea of a strategy, is that it allows us to shift perspective.
How so?
We move from analyzing the game as a sequence of individual moves back and forth to thinking about players choosing entire strategies right at the outset.
Okay.
Once each player has chosen their strategy, their complete plan, the entire course of the game, and the final outcome are completely determined. It's a way to simplify the analysis of these complex sequential interactions.
So instead of thinking move by move by move, we can just think about the overall plan versus the other player's overall plan.
Exactly. A strategy is like a pre-commitment, a commitment to a course of action, contingent on whatever might happen during the game. It collapses the whole tree of possibilities into a single choice for each player.
That does sound like a powerful simplification. Okay, so the book then delves into specific types of games, kicking off with zero-sum two-person games. Theory. Why this particular focus so early on?
Well, zero-sum two-person games are, in a way, the simplest form of pure strategic conflict.
Right, the win-lose scenario we mentioned.
Precisely. The interests of the two players are directly opposed. Whatever one player gains, the other loses, dollar for dollar or point for point. This stark opposition makes them particularly amenable to mathematical analysis. It allows von Neumann and Morgenstern to develop fundamental concepts that can then be extended to more complex scenarios later.
A manageable starting point.
Exactly. And they often analyze these games in what they call a normalized form. This is a simplified representation, usually a matrix. It imagines both players making their choices simultaneously, and the matrix shows the payoffs for every possible combination of choices.
The payoff matrix, yeah, I've seen those.
Right. It clearly lays out the consequences of each pair of strategies.
And this is where the famous ideas of maximin and minimax become crucial, right? How did these help players figure out what to do in a zero-sum game?
They're fundamental. In a zero-sum game, a rational player wants to maximize their own payoff. But since it's zero-sum, that's the same as minimizing their opponent's payoff, or minimizing their own potential loss.
Okay.
The maximum strategy for player one is about being cautious. They look at the worst possible outcome for each of their strategies, assuming the opponent plays optimally against them, and choose the strategy that gives the best of these worst outcomes. Maximize the minimum.
Guaranteeing the best possible worst case.
Exactly. It's a defensive strategy. Conversely, the minimax strategy for player two, who wants to minimize player one's gain, is to look at the best outcome player one could achieve for each of player two's strategies, and then choose the strategy that minimizes this maximum gain for player one. Minimize the maximum.
So one player is maximizing their minimum guarantee, the other is minimizing the maximum they could lose.
Precisely.
What happens when those two values? When the maximum value for player one equals the minimax value that player two is trying to enforce.
That's the sweet spot. When the maximum and minimax values coincide, the game is said to be strictly determined.
Strictly determined.
Yes, this point represents a stable equilibrium, often called a saddle point in the payoff matrix. Both players have an optimal pure strategy, a single strategy they should always play, and if both play rationally, they will arrive at this specific outcome. The value of the game is then this agreed-upon equilibrium payoff.
And they found something interesting about games with perfect information.
Yes, a key result here is that all zero-sum two-person games with perfect information where all players know all the previous moves, think chess or checkers, are strictly determined. In theory, there's an optimal pure strategy for each player, even if it's incredibly complex to find.
Interesting. The book also discusses mathematical expectation and its role, particularly when chance enters the picture, like rolling dice. How does that fit in?
Right, not all games are purely deterministic. When a game involves elements of chance, dice rolls, card draws, whatever the outcome of a player's strategy isn't certain anymore.
You can't guarantee a specific result.
Exactly. In such cases, players need to think in terms of the expected utility of their strategies. This is calculated by taking a weighted average of the utilities of all possible outcomes, where the weights are the probabilities of those outcomes actually happening.
So you play the odds.
You play the odds rationally. Rational players will then choose the strategy that maximizes their expected utility, their average payoff over the long run, considering the probabilities involved.
Okay, and then there's this fascinating idea of mixed strategies. It seems almost counterintuitive at first, like deliberately playing randomly. Why is that sometimes the best way to play?
Yeah, it does seem weird, doesn't it? But mixed strategies become absolutely essential in games that are not strictly determined. Think about rock, paper, scissors, or matching pennies.
Right, no single best move always.
Exactly. In those games, if you always choose the same action, say always playing rock, your opponent will quickly figure it out and exploit it by always playing paper. You become predictable.
So you need to mix it up.
You need to mix it up. A
There you
mixed
go.
strategy involves choosing your pure strategies, rock, paper, or scissors, for instance, according to certain probabilities. You might decide to play rock 50% of the time, paper 30%, and scissors 20%.
Okay.
This introduces an element of unpredictability. It makes it much harder for your opponent to anticipate your specific next move, and that protects you from being systematically exploited.
So it's really about keeping your opponent guessing, preventing them from finding an exploitable pattern in what you do.
Precisely that. You're essentially randomizing to make their prediction problem harder. And this leads directly to one of the most significant results in all of game theory, the minimax theorem.
The minimax theorem.
Yes, though they develop it more fully later in the book. It essentially states that in any zero-sum two-person game, if you allow players to use mixed strategies, the maximum value achievable by player one, using their best mixed strategy, will always be equal to the minimax value that player two can enforce, using their best mixed strategy.
So there's always an equilibrium, even if it involves randomness.
Exactly. It guarantees that there's always a stable equilibrium value for the game, even in games like rock, paper, scissors that don't have a pure strategy saddle point. It's a really powerful and fundamental result.
Wow, okay. So as the book progresses beyond these foundational chapters on two-person zero-sum games, what are some of the more advanced topics and types of games that von Neumann and Morgenstern start to explore?
Well, the book definitely moves into increasingly complex territory. They delve deeper into the mathematical underpinnings, things like convexity, properties of strategy spaces. More abstract math concepts become important.
Right.
But a major expansion comes with the analysis of n-person games, games where there are more than two players involved.
Yeah. Things get messy then, I imagine.
They certainly get more complicated because now you have the possibility of coalitions forming. Groups of players might find it beneficial to cooperate, to team up against others, to achieve a better outcome for themselves. This adds a whole new layer of strategic complexity. It's not just pure conflict anymore.
Cooperation enters the picture.
Exactly. So they start developing concepts relevant to cooperative game theory. They also revisit and generalize the concept of utility to handle these more complex multiplayer scenarios, thinking about things like transferable utility. Can players make side payments to each other?
So it gets much richer dealing with alliances and negotiations.
Much richer, yes.
Yeah.
They begin to grapple with the core problems of social organization through this game theoretic lens.
And throughout all of this mathematical development and exploration of different game types, the overarching goal was still ultimately to provide a foundation for understanding economic behavior, right? They didn't lose sight of that.
Absolutely not. That remains the driving ambition. While the initial focus is often on games as these abstract mathematical structures, and they needed to build that rigorous foundation first, the ultimate aim was always to apply these principles to the complexities of economic interaction.
Bridging the gap.
Yes. They truly believed that by rigorously analyzing strategic decision-making in these various game-like situations, they could gain much deeper insights into real-world economic phenomena, things like competition, cooperation, bargaining, the formation of markets. The later parts of the book explicitly try to make these connections to bridge that gap between the abstract theory and concrete economic problems.
Okay. So having taken this, really deep dive through the entirety of theory of games and economic behavior, what would you say are the most crucial takeaways for our listener? What should they really hold on to?
I think the key takeaways are, first, the book's groundbreaking effort, establishing this rigorous mathematical framework for analyzing strategic interactions, any situation where outcomes are interdependent. That was revolutionary.
Yeah.
Second, introducing the fundamental concepts, the formal definition of a game, strategies as these complete plans, and utility as a way to represent preferences numerically. Third, the detailed analysis of zero-sum two-person games, bringing in maximum, minimax, and the pivotal minimax theorem that provides a cornerstone for understanding strategic conflict.
Right, the foundation.
And finally, the book's sheer ambition, extending this framework to more complex n-person games, exploring cooperation, and always aiming to provide a new, more solid foundation for economic theory itself. That highlights its profound and really lasting influence.
And what is it about this work that makes it so enduringly significant, still talked about so much today?
Its significance, I think, lies in its pioneering approach. It brought mathematical rigor to studying strategic behavior and social interactions in a way that just hadn't been done before.
It wasn't just applying old math.
No, it wasn't just applying existing mathematics to economics. It was about creating essentially a new field of inquiry with its own concepts, its own tools, its own logic. And its influence has been immense, truly immense. It shaped not only economics, but also fields like political science, psychology, sociology, even computer science, and artificial intelligence. It provided a powerful new way to think about decision making whenever the actions of others matter.
Hopefully, this comprehensive exploration has given you, our listener, a thorough understanding of the core ideas pulsing through this foundational text, and maybe, just maybe, sparked some new ways of thinking about strategic interactions in your own life.
Indeed. It's worth thinking about. As you navigate the world, consider how these fundamental principles, strategy, interdependence, looking for optimal outcomes, how they play out. You see them everywhere, from everyday negotiations to really complex global challenges. It makes you wonder, what games are you participating in, and how might the insights from von Neumann and Morgenstern offer a perhaps surprising new perspective?
That's a really powerful thought to leave us with. This has certainly been a deep dive into a truly monumental work. We absolutely encourage you to revisit any parts that particularly resonated or sparked your curiosity. Thanks for joining us on this comprehensive exploration.